Hi everybody, this is FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos, and today we're going to take a look at a very recently played game from the World Team Championship in Turkey. And this is from round 5, and we're going to take a look at Gelfand-Nakamura's very impressive win over Boris Gelfand. Okay, so Nakamura had black, and usually I don't cover recent games in this forum, though we did with the World Cup a few weeks ago. Generally, I save the this sort of show for my chess-based programs, but there I do usually historic games. Anyway, this is just a very interesting game and really exciting, and seemed worth sharing with you guys anyway. So, without any further ado, let's take a look. So we have a King's Indian, and we have the classical, which is very much a fun and incredibly complicated line. So this is the starting position, we could say, of the mainline classical King's Indian defense. And White's main idea here. Well, we can talk about what both sides are up to. So first of all, we have this pawn chain here. So White's got these guys, and Black has, let's use a different color. Black has these guys pointing in this direction. So the rule of thumb is whichever way your pawn chain points when you're going in an upward direction, that's the side of the board where you will normally be playing. So again, like any kind of rule of thumb like this, it's quite very much a generality, very much a generalization. There are all kinds of exceptions, but as a helpful rule of thumb, especially if you're trying to just kind of find your way in it, it's useful. And certainly those of you who have any familiarity with the theory of these mainline classical King's Indians will know it's very much the case. So White's goal is to play on the queen side and Black's on the king side. And accordingly, one of Black's main aims is to make this pawn storm so often with f5, and the pawn will often keep going to f4, and this guy will go to g5, and the knight comes to g6, and Black just shoves everybody over to the left, and White on his left side will do the same thing. So White wants to achieve the move c5 here. This is pretty much standard operating procedure. But how to do it? An ideal move would be something like bishop to e3. But the problem with this is knight to g4. So we can't allow that. Well, we could play knight to e1. This is a main move. It stops knight to g4. And then bishop to e3 and f3. The problem with this, there's one other good point of it too, which is that the knight on d3 can also sometimes help this c-pawn to advance. The drawback is that the knight is kind of stupid on e1 and just as stupid on d3. Really, the best square for the knight would be on c4. So this would be ideal. Well, how do we do that? We play knight to d1. Knight to d2. Let me get rid of all this stuff. So knight to d2 would be the plan there. On the other hand, the knight on d2 blocks in the bishop on c1. So that's a little bit of a drawback to the move. The main move here is to play b4, which is the most obvious move in the world, but for a long time it wasn't really considered all that hot. Maybe one reason was because of the response a5 when White can't play a3, so he has to kind of fragment his pawn structure. But this really isn't such a big deal. So White can play either b takes a5 here or bishop to a3, and let's say takes. And if b6, okay, White is not able to get c5 immediately, but he plays a4, and then he achieves a5. And since AB at some point CB would be much worse for Black's pawn structure, Black will generally meet a5 with b takes a5, but then the c-pawn will be ready to go again. So anyway, this is playable. I mean, this is one of the main lines here. The main line of b4 is knight h5, and this of course goes in its own fun and crazy directions. And Black can also play knight e8. And after knight to e8, knight to d2 is typical. White would like to play bishop to e3 here, but f5 is very inconvenient. So the bishop is not stable on e3. So knight to d2, f5, and now c5 or f3, and then c5 later. So knight f6, f3, f4, knight to c4, g5, and so on. And this, in fact, is the position we reach in the game, though with a different move order. So in the game, it was knight to d2 first. Now here, black has a number of moves. You can play c5, you can play knight to d7, and a5 is probably the most, well, it's the most common and perhaps the most stable of the options. But Nakamura chose knight to e8, and he's used this before with great effect. Okay, so we race through the next few moves since we already saw them. b4, preparing c5, f5 with kingside expansion, c5, knight f6. Black's aim is to put pressure here on the e4 pawn, and so white plays f3. This is quite common, solidifying the structure. I should say that black should not play f4 in this position. See if you can figure out why not. A little positional quiz for you. Okay, well, the reason is bishop to g4. And black is, generally speaking, going to be very unhappy to trade off the light-squared bishops. And the reason is that he very often needs this bishop to sacrifice on h3, or in some other way to engage, in a kingside breakthrough. So it's only after knight f6, f3 that f4 is safe. Okay, so knight c4, putting pressure on d6, g5. Black's main idea is to just keep rolling these pawns. So g4, often supported by h5. Okay, a4, knight to g6, bishop a3. Okay, so this is taking some aim here at the d6 pawn. So you can see, various ways for white to exert pressure. So he could take and play knight to b5, or he could take and play b5. Also, of course, it just clears the c1 square for the rook. And okay, so here a very typical idea for black, rook f7. All right, so the point of rook f7, it's a very, very well-known maneuver. It's been around for decades and decades in the King's Indian, not necessarily just in this position, but in the King's Indian classical period. And it has kind of a threefold purpose. So one idea of rook f7, of course, is that we're protecting c7, which is very important. We have to keep white's guys off of that square. Secondly, it clears f8 for the bishop, which enables it to solidify this pawn on d6. And then third of all, after bishop f8, there's rook to g7, and the rook is going to join in the fun as well on the king side with h5 and g4. Okay, now in our game, Gelfand played b5, but in an earlier game last year between Alexander Bilyavsky and Nakamura, Bilyavsky played a5. And I'll just very quickly go through this game just so you can see it, but won't cover it in any great detail. So h5, so we see the typical ideas. b5, d takes c5. Okay, b6. So white is, of course, trying to puncture the black queen side and break through. Now, this strategy might seem kind of strange to you for the simple reason that if white breaks through on the queen side but gets mated, who really cares? So it may seem like a kind of a strange decision by white. For him, victory means maybe winning a couple of pawns, while for black, victory just means giving checkmate. But the thing is that white is much faster. So, white is faster, and the question is whether he's enough faster. So that might be a way of thinking about it. So white does break through more quickly. And the thing is, once white floods through, it's amazing how fast he can kind of turn the corner and outflank black and get to the king side. Okay, well, not in this particular game. So Nakamura played g4, bc7, rook c7, knight to b5, g3, knight c7, and here comes the big idea. So knight takes e4. And so the basic point, and I just show you this to illustrate what I was remarking on before about the bishop on c8. So if f takes e4, which didn't happen in the game, queen h4, h3, bishop takes h3. So tricks like this are very much par for the course in the King's Indian. So Bilyavsky played knight to e6, takes, queen h4, and knight to g3. And it may not look too serious yet. In fact, Bilyavsky was still in the game at this point, if I remember right. It wasn't hopeless just yet. So e4, the idea of, among other things, playing e3 to keep the white king from running out. Rook a4, rook c8, and then here I think this was the losing move, or certainly it made the position go from difficult to lost. bishop takes a7. And this looks quite normal, saving the bishop and grabbing a pawn. But Nakamura had this nice shot with b5, simply forking the pieces. And it's also important because if he takes the knight, then e3 can be played without any sacrifices happening. And the problem is with a takes b6, whoops, if a takes b6, then bishop to d4 check. So it cuts off the bishop on a7, and after queen d4, knight e2 is mate. Okay, so rook to b4, grabs the knight, and so now e3 is coming. King e1 is not much fun because of bishop to c3, winning the queen, and then more stuff to come. So takes, king takes, knight f1, and black is, okay, it's maybe not catastrophic material, it's just a piece for 3 pawns, but the white king is in big trouble, obviously, it's wide open, but maybe Bilyavsky lost on time here. Anyway, Nakamura is, I think, winning in this position, and it was a very, very impressive game, very much, Nakamura definitely got big kudos from the chess press for this victory. So going back here, Gelfand chose instead of a5 to play the move b5. All right. So again, similar ideas. White is building up for, among other things, b6, and of course he's just threatening to take on d6 here. Well, black plays something a little bit unusual at this point, although we saw it in the Bilyavsky game too. So it's maybe not quite so unusual in this variation. But usually, black doesn't initiate this exchange. So d takes c5, bishop c5. So the plus for black is that the c-file stays closed longer. The plus for white is that now white can try to just bust through with d6. Okay, h5. And now, various possibilities for white. h3 is a bit risky, although Ftashnik, who's a great expert in this opening with white, played it back in 2006 against Polzin and won, but I think Golyabev, for one, thinks that this is dubious. Anyway, you can explore that one on your own. The main move is the one that Gelfand played, which is a5. Okay, g4. So all typical stuff. b6, g3. Here we go. King h1. The idea of this is very interesting, and I first learned of this from Gurevich, Dmitry Gurevich, many years ago. So I had the chance when I was young to play some speed games with him, and I used to be a King's Indian fiend. And this was one of the maneuvers that he would often use, though not in this particular system. The idea was to play bishop to g1 in these positions. And, okay, the h2 is covered, so there's no immediate worries about queen h4, queen h2 mate, because the bishop will cover. And after g takes h2, then the bishop jumps back to f2, or somewhere else, and the pawn on h2 ends up getting in black's way. So it's a very, very clever idea. All right. Well, here, Nakamura found a nice idea. Actually, this is still theory, but played bishop to f8. And, of course, this is an excellent move for a couple of reasons. So one is that the exchange is just not very good for white. Or rather, I should say, not the exchange, but taking. Because after bishop takes f8, there's no exchange. Black just plays knight takes e4, and white's completely lost. So the point is, any capture on e4, pretty much anything else from white, queen h4, bishop h3, and it's mate in just a couple of moves. So that's impossible. Bishop to g1, bishop to g1 looks pretty reasonable. And this was played in a game in 2008 between Russell Ruzman and Pascal Charbonneau. And Nakamura was actually there, and this game influenced him. So after bishop to g1, Charbonneau played knight h4. Here I would say h takes g3, h takes g3 is worth a look. We'll take a look at a similar variation in the game, in our main game. Rook to a2 is kind of complicated as well. Maybe black can play bishop to h3. So another trick that shows the value of the bishop, the light-squared bishop. Of course, taking is no good because of g2 mate. All right, so bishop to d3, clearing the rook's defense here on g2. Okay, a takes b6, so just grabbing. Gh3, rook g7, And this is just very, very complicated, so I'm not going to make any really hard and fast claims about what's going on here. But this is worth your while to look at as well if you're a fan of this variation. And really just for your own entertainment. I mean, I think this is one of the most entertaining variations in chess to examine, where you get these crazy races and things going on both sides and just play all over the board with lots of sacrifices. Okay, so in the game, though, White didn't take on g3 and he didn't play rook to a2. He played rook to e1. And this looks pretty smart. I mean, you're just covering f1. You're clearing f1 for the bishop to retreat. What could be wrong with that? Well, there is something wrong with it. See if you can figure out what that is. Well, here's the answer. Charbonneau played knight takes g2. And if he can get away with this, then White's position is hopeless. And as we'll see, he can. So king g2, rook g7, obvious threats. Knight takes e5 is what Roussel-Roussemann tried, but g takes h2 is just winning. If king takes h2, then knight takes e4 and queen h4 mate. And okay, in the game, king h1 is given. Don't know if that's right, but anyway, the same move works here. Knight takes e4. So very nice. And the point is that after knight takes e4, say knight e4, hg, let's make a rook for fun, takes, and queen h4 is checkmate. Okay, so going back to here, after bishop to f8, we've seen that bishop takes f8 is just a blunder. Bishop to g1 might be playable, but it might be dangerous. And Gelfand chose door number 3, which was d6, so this was a new move. At least a new move as far as play goes. I think this might have been analyzed by Golubev in his King's Indian book at one time. Okay, so d6 is quite logical. It again cuts off the bishop from f8, and it doesn't let it get anywhere else either. So it's not just that it doesn't get to go to c5, it's not going anywhere. And this is part of White's plan. Alright, so here Nakamura plays a takes b6. Okay, and now a takes b6 is possible, but wasn't played. So ab, rook a1, queen a1, cd6, rook to d1. And I had analyzed this on my blog, little plug here, so that's thechessmind.net. And I had looked at d5, which is very, very interesting. Again, with the same idea of drawing this bishop away. So again, if bishop takes f8, knight takes e4. Okay, if f takes e4, queen h4, h3, bishop takes h3, bishop c5, trying to run back, but d4, we cut him off. And now after bishop takes g2, it's a forced mate. Like that. Lots of fun. Okay, and likewise, going back. Okay, if knight takes e4, then again, queen h4, same idea, h3, bishop takes h3, same idea, bishop c5. The point of that is, so that way when the bishop retreats, king g1, queen h2, king f1, queen h1, the bishop can block on g1. Okay, so d takes e4. We're threatening e3 now, little interference motif. And, of course, White doesn't want to play bishop to g1 here, because then it would shut in the king. Bishop retreats, and it's mating. So queen a8 check here. Bishop to d3, takes. Okay, and just White has to go through all kinds of craziness just to avoid an immediate mate, but it's hopeless. Alright, so I don't have to give the rest of this variation. Okay, so after d5, though, instead of bishop takes f8, I think with knight takes d5, White's probably okay. Kind of surprising, but looks like it's the case. Now, first of all, well, let me see. If bishop takes c5, I think then that knight to c7 is okay, but maybe there's something even better. Maybe knight takes e5. But my main move, okay, yeah, you can't play knight takes e4. That for sure doesn't work because a knight to e7 check. If knight takes d5, then I think the position ends up being equal. So rook d5, queen h4, bishop g1, and okay, something like this. Whatever, roughly equal about here. So black has to be a little bit careful about his queenside and about the e5 point, but White's not going to get to go too crazy because of the open g file and the weak back rank. Okay, so D5, I think, isn't killing. So Golubov, though, has a much better suggestion. And this was in chess today. And actually, Rybka. Once I ran Rybka on this, it came up with this move, too. So knight to G4. And this is quite strong. So, for instance, if bishop takes D6, queen H4. Okay, we already know this. H3, knight F2, bishop takes H3. Bishop F1, just bishop to E6, any, and then queen H1 mate. Okay, so and then Golubov's line was F takes G4, queen H4, bishop G1, HG4, and he wrote that white can hardly survive this, and stops. It's a little bit of a shame that he stopped because there's some really pretty lines, so I'll show you some of the stuff that I came up with here. Okay, well F3 is clearly black's big idea. So black wants to just smash through and make this possible, and open F4 for the knight, and after GF3, the bishop coming to H3. You can just see, I mean, F3 looks really pretty delicious here. So knight to D2 makes sense. So we can sacrifice a piece and block on F3. All right, so bishop to E6. First stopping bishop to C4, and next comes G takes H2. And now the lines are really funny. Okay, so the idea here is to play G takes H2, as I said. And you can see the bishop's got no safe squares. All right, where does it go? If it takes on H2, then G3 wins the piece back. So we have some funny tries here. And of course, it also can be mating. All right, so one funny move is rook to F1. So the idea is, of course, G takes H2, bishop F2. But the rook on F1 takes a square away from another defensive piece. So black's best move is, and you might want to try to figure this out for yourself, very pretty, queen H8. So the threat is to play rook H7 here and take advantage of the fact that black, let's try that one again. F1 is occupied, so the knight can't protect on H2. So the rook's got to move away, but now we play F3. Takes, now knight F4, again threatening a little mate on G2. Bishop F1 covers it. Oh, but now once again, the knight can't go to F1, so rook H7 forces mate quickly. Very amusing. Okay, another try. Queen to B2. Well, now we'll just see the basic idea. GH, G3, and it doesn't matter if white plays knight F1 or knight F3. He's just losing. And black can do some other things too, but this is good enough and should be winning for black. All right, so going back to this position here, after black played A takes B6, doesn't seem that white can respond in kind with AB. So Gelfand played bishop to G1 here. All right, now what does black do in this position? No, well, actually, I'm not sure. It is a very important spot, although I'm not sure that the move that Nakamura chose is the only good move here. Okay, well, first of all, in Golubov's old analysis, he gave B takes A5 unclear back in 2006. He's since repented of it and says that now, after DC7, Queen C7, Knight B5, he feels that white has an unpleasant initiative in this position. So, going back, another try is the immediate G takes H2. And, okay, this is somewhat similar. Bishop F2, BA5 takes, but now Queen takes, and here. And generally speaking, such a transition would favor white, but black's up 3 pawns. So white is going to have to take some time rounding up all of the stragglers here and there. And in the meantime, I think maybe black can be okay. So, for instance, Knight B5, Rook C6, Knight A7, Rook C7. Okay, now he takes this one. B5 gets to get rid of another one, but this trade of rooks is helpful for black. And I think this ending should just be a draw. So this is a possibility, but it's not a very enterprising one. I mean, it's basically a way of trying to kind of cool the jets and get a half point. Sometimes that's okay, but people don't usually play the classical King's Indian with black aiming for a draw. So Nakamura chose the much more dynamic knight to H4. Here I think white's best move is probably h takes g3, which I mentioned in the context of the Charbonneau game earlier. So after h takes g3, I mean, it looks really risky, but I don't see any easy win. So I'll show you my main analysis here. So f takes g3. Maybe that's wrong. I don't know. Maybe rook to g7. Just kind of guessing off the top of my head here, but that doesn't look right. I think black just loses the knight, and white plays bishop to f2 to safeguard the h-pawn. So fg, bishop to e3, and okay, actually maybe something quiet like knight to g6 could be considered, followed by h4, h3. So that might be another possibility, but well, maybe. So you're at least protecting the e5 pawn. So maybe that deserves a bit of examination. All right. Anyway, my line was bishop to h3, rook to g1. Okay, and now if we try queen to c8, aiming for bishop g2 followed by queen to h3, white just plays bishop to f1, and black is, if not completely out of business, at least hurting here. Okay, so bishop g2, rook g2, knight g2. If rook takes rook to g7, some interesting lines, but again, I didn't quite get full compensation here. So some crazy nonsense like this, and I didn't see any breakthrough. But okay, all of this is, it's a long variation, and so there are probably lots of places where we can vary along the way. And it seems, though, as if white survives at the end of all this. So black's got a lot of threats. I mean, he's threatening to bring the queen or the rook to h3. He's threatening knight takes f3. And even has 3 pawns ready for the piece. So it doesn't seem like it should be that bad. But knight to g5 check just covers everything. And meanwhile, white is ready to pounce on the d file. So it looks like this is forced. And then queen h3. And again, it seems really, really exciting. But after bishop h4, what is there? So some fun like this. And right now white has an extra rook and bishop for 4 pawns, but loose king, and the pawn on g2 is not too far from nirvana, so or some kind of ultimate bliss. Anyway, rook to d7, king h8, king to d2. So the king keeps scurrying away. b5, another funny move, but we'll see the point. Alright, so we've opened the b file. So that was the big point. And finally, the pawn queens. Alright, and this nonsense line we can conclude with white being definitely better, but is it a win? I don't know. No idea. Alright, so this 25 move variation perhaps is not entirely forced. Anyway, that was, okay, here, after rook to g7, started all that nonsense. After the more prosaic knight takes g2, king g2, bishop d6, ab, takes. I don't think white has so much here. So this is, I don't think that black has a big attack, but white's advantage probably isn't so great either. So anyway, very interesting position still, but calmer than the game. Anyway, let's see. Other possibilities. Okay, so I didn't mention, let me see, did I mention rook a2? So rook a2 is another try for white. So trying to shore up the second rank. On this, bishop h3 once again. So we've seen this trick before. Bishop to d3. And Golubev doesn't really find this position so safe for white. I didn't see any big advantage, so I think, I don't remember if this is my line or his line, but didn't seem to amount to too much for black. So I think black's got everything, or white's got everything covered. And we have another position where white has 2 bishops for a knight and 3 pawns. So who knows what's going on here. But this definitely favors black. It's just a matter of how much. Okay. So that was that. As I said, DC... Oh, yeah, DC fails. It's very attractive. Bishop h3. And that's why rook a2 made more sense. So there's just no good way to cover the g2 square here. All right, so Gelfand chose a 4th option, which was rook to e1, getting the rook out of the way for bishop to f1. All right, so what is black to do? Black to move play here. So it's not bishop to h3 because bishop to f1 and all is well. Well, here we have the Charbonneau move. Knight takes g2. Now, the position is not winning for black just yet. It's still okay for white, but he's got to play accurately. And it seems that the only move here is just to take the knight. Okay, so I tried a number of moves to find a win for black. Couldn't do it. So one is to play queen d7, aiming for queen h3 check followed by g2 mate. But the king just goes back, and on queen h3, bishop to f1. If h4, trying to just steamroller with the pawns, then hg3. Let's say h3 check, f takes g3, and it looks scary, but again, it comes up just a little bit short. So dc, ab, and black just doesn't have the chance to get his fun here. So rook a1, bc, takes, knight b5, and white's clearly better. So it's not over, but the pawns can't push through by themselves. Okay, after king g2, then the best move here is rook to g7. Alright, and now h3 is no good. It's very natural, but queen d7 and the pawn can't be protected. And, of course, now that it's on h3 rather than on h2, the white king can't hide behind it. So after something like bishop b6 is trying to clear the way for defenders, takes, check, mate. Okay, so that's no good. If d takes c7, then two good moves here for black. One is queen e7, and on knight takes b6, then knight takes e4. Okay, so if knight e4, g takes h2 with the forced mate that we saw earlier from the Charbonneau game, and if queen to d8, then bishop to h3 and wins the queen. Okay, another possibility is g takes h2. And now, if king takes h2, how does black win? Of course, knight to g4 check. So we get the queen to h4, and good things happen. And actually, wait, on this line? Yeah, incredibly, I think this line ends up... No, this line, yeah, black is just winning. Okay. So the right move here is to hide behind the pawn, strangely enough. So takes, and the point is that white will get rid of something of black's in time. So black doesn't have time to play knight g4 because his queen's hanging. So queen c7, ab, takes, and this is just equal. So I think I came up with this on my blog, and also Zagrabelny, GM, I forgot, I think he was annotating this for Chess Pro, found the same line and extended it a couple more moves. And this is going to be a draw. Okay, so this was a very long line, and it looks like black survives here, but not after queen e7. So, and I think that was a Golubev variation here. Okay, but the main line, I think again found by just about everyone, was h takes g3 in this position. And now, okay, I think queen d7 was my attempt to win here, and the best I got was maybe a slight edge for black. So g4 is forced, takes, and despite all this activity, again, black is down stuff. He's down a piece for two pawns, and his pieces aren't quite fast enough for the kill. So knight e5 covers f3, so he's just in time. Bishop d6, takes, rook g1, and the rook is pinned. So again, black doesn't quite have everything he needs. Alright, rook a5, rook a to g1, rook h5. And again, it's looking really grim for white, but white just keeps holding on by a thread. Okay, queen d1, rook g4 check. And, okay, black is a little bit better, but probably this should be a draw. So it's still interesting, though. Anyway, that was one line. Okay, a second line. After h takes g3, I think this is from Nakamura. Rook takes g3 check. King h1, rook h3, bishop h2, knight to g4. Okay, so this is threatening rook takes h2, and okay, white can make a couple of checks, but at some point he has to take, and then we have a perpetual check, and so on. Alright, so it looks as if with best play, after knight takes g2, white can hold on with king g2, rook g7, h g3, and so on. Alright, in the game though, Gelfand played d takes c7. And this looks really logical. I mean, we saw a lot of lines where this really helped white out a lot, opening up the center, making sure that the queen can't stay on the d8 h4 diagonal, so that way he won't have time to play knight to g4, knight takes e4, and then swing the queen to h4. Okay, but Gelfand did miss something here. Not on this move probably, but at some point along the way. So what should black to move do in this position? Okay, well the answer is, you should just take the rook. Knight takes e1 with the threat of g2 mate. Kind of funny. So of course, cd, g2. Can be up two queens, but you get mated. So queen takes. And now, well, black is going to keep using this theme and just beat white over the head to death with this. So g2 check, king g2, rook to g7 check. Alright, big trouble for white once again. He can't go to f2 because then bishop to c5 or queen to d4 forces king f1, and then he gets sliced up by the other bishop, mate on h3. So he's got to go to h1. Okay, well now surely he's got to do something about his queen, right? Nope, not really. Bishop to h3. So once again threatening mate. Bishop f1. Okay, well now clearly he's got to move the queen. Well, I mean he could play bishop takes f1, but then he's running out of attackers. So what does black to move do in this position? The answer is queen at e3. And Nakamura thinks this is probably the move that Gelfand missed. Seems quite plausible. And it's a very nice move. So obviously the threat is to take on f3. So bishop h3, queen f3, mate on g2. Okay, of course he can't take the queen for the same familiar reason, mate on g2. So Gelfand plays knight takes e5, and this looks good. So it's saving the knight from any possible dangers, hitting the queen, protecting f3, and grabbing a pawn just for the fun of it. Isn't this good enough? Well, once again, the answer is it's not. Bishop takes f1. So one more time, exploiting the mate threat on g2. So white has to play queen takes f1, and now queen c3. And surprisingly, after all of that, I mean, we keep seeing black offering material, but as it turns out in this position, black is up a rook for one pawn, so it's just over. Gelfand played rook to c1, regains a little material, so he loses the knight, but he queens, but all he got back there was the exchange for a pawn, so he's down a full piece at this point. And one last move, queen to e6. So it stops any queen c4 check business, and Gelfand simply resigned here. So a very, very nice game by Nakamura. Probably some of it was prep, but I'm sure most of it, including all of those queen sacrifices, had to have been found over the board. So very impressive, whichever way it was, whether the whole thing was prepared at home, which I don't think, or none of it was. So a very nice game, very pretty, and really, really cool kind of thematic idea to have these repeated mate threats on g2 with combined with leaving the queen en prise for like 5 or 6 moves in a row. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed that. It's, again, not a typical show. Usually I don't do, let's say, current events games on here, but every once in a while I suppose it's okay. So I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks a lot, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.